everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce Jim Funkhouser from Inspective. He is a home inspector here in Northern Virginia, and he's also a member of ASHI. And Jim has about 30 years experience as a home inspector, and we've worked with Jim many, many times. He's also a very funny character, full of beans always. Lovely to see you.
Nice to see you. Thank you.
Today. So let's get going then, and let me ask you just some questions. What does a home inspection typically consist of?
Okay, well, there is a standard of practice that all home inspectors follow. In the Commonwealth of Virginia, we have a certain standard of practice that enumerates all of the things that we must observe and all of the things that we must comment on. It's quite extensive, but for the average home buyer, it wouldn't hurt for them to go online to D4 line and actually see the things that we are looking at. You can also, for those of us that are members of the American Society of Home Inspectors, you can go to the ASHI website, which is homeinspector.org. And you can actually see the standard of practice and the code of ethics that we have to follow. It's the sort of things that we do is, in a nutshell, we look at the house, note its various components, and then write our opinion about the condition of those components.
Okay. Now, what doesn't it include? So when I ask this question, I'm thinking specifically, you know, if a house has a well, if it has a septic tank, if it has a residential elevator.
Right.
Those kinds of things. Are those included?
No. Typically they're not. Every once in a while you'll find an inspector, based on where they're located, the market demands that they say they'll inspect wells, okay? In our area they don't. They're not going to inspect the swimming pool, they're not going to inspect the elevator, they're not going to inspect spas, hot tubs, they're not going to inspect, I'm trying to think of other things, playground equipment, anything that's really outside the scope, and again that's going back to the standard of practice. All of those things that are excluded are enumerated in the standard of practice as well as in most home inspectors' contracts. I know absolutely nothing about elevators. I would be a dangerous person to say this doesn't work right. There's special knowledge that you need for certain things like that. Lawn irrigation systems is another big one that we don't inspect. And the reason we don't is it's simple enough to turn the thing on and see if the sprinkler heads work. That doesn't tell you if I don't have a broken pipe underneath the ground. Water still may be coming out of there, but I'm losing most of the water through that line, and I don't want to lead you to believe that everything is okay with something that I can't lay eyes on. Okay. So we're going to, as a home inspector, I'm going to tell you to go call a specialist in that area, lawn irrigation service, which you're going to need to do anyway, because in the wintertime you have to winterize it, drain the water out, otherwise the pipes freeze, and you're going to have to unwinterize it in the spring to get it back into working order. They can go and put pressure on those lines and actually measure it with a gauge to make sure that there are no leaks or damage to the underground lines. Right. Okay, and so that's also going to be another thing that's going to be in my report, is that it's important to have those winterized. Don't forget, because we have a big freeze. If those pipes break, now we're redoing the entire system, and that's not cheap.
No, absolutely. Okay. So to recap then, ASHI members, people can go online and
absolutely.
ASHI, A-S-H-I, but they can also go to DPOR,
yes.
The Department of Professional Organization and Regulation.
Correct.
And they can actually look up the credentials that a typical home inspector has to have here in Northern Virginia.
Yes. As of last July 1st, all home inspectors practicing in the Commonwealth of Virginia must be licensed. And that means several different things. First of all, they have to pass the National Home Inspector exam, which is I'm very familiar with that. I used to be president of the Examination Board of Professional Home Inspectors. And for 4 years, I was in charge of all the question writing for the exam. That is used right now in 28 states for licensing. So you must pass that exam in 28 states to be able to practice the profession of home inspection. Once they pass that, they actually have to have X number of years of experience, or there's kind of a tiered system, frankly, that you either have to have X number of years of experience, or you have to have X number of years of are X number of continuing education credits. And some of the newer ones, they're requiring parallel inspections, meaning where the new inspector has to go on ride-alongs and do an inspection along with an established, experienced home inspector. Then that home inspector would then review that new person's report to verify that they're doing a good job. And they have to do X number of those, and I don't remember the number, what it is, but it's a certain amount to verify that they have at least minimal competency, that they're not out there with so little information that they're going to harm the public. And frankly, the bottom line of what I do is that to protect the public from getting into a problem, either safety-wise first and foremost, or financially.
Right. Right. Okay. And it is interesting to note that while we're talking about home inspections,
yes.
That wells and septic tanks and irrigation systems are not included, including swimming pools. So the advice is for homeowners to basically
get those done,
to get the different trades in who specialize in those areas.
And if you do that ahead of time, you're going to be in better shape as far as your contingency period for the contract.
Yes.
If you wait until the home inspection, and if that's towards the end of your contingency period, you may not have enough time to get the pool guy in there, and puts people like you in a panic trying to get somebody out there at the last minute.
Absolutely. Now, if there's a secondary dwelling, an accessory dwelling, in other words,
right, guest house, right.
Do you include that?
Well, it'll be an additional fee. It's inspecting a completely separate house with its own systems. I did about a month and a half ago, I did a farm complex out in Leesburg. It had the original country home, 113 years old, and then it had a guest house, which was a decent sized Cape Cod, and then it had a tenant house, and then it had the greenhouse, and then it had the chicken house, and then it had the well house, and so all of those, and 2 barns. So all of those were priced additionally. Okay. But as a package group, obviously, I'm not charging for the guest house the same way I'm charging for the original house. There's a discount, and that's going to be negotiable between the buyer and the home inspector.
Absolutely.
So, but when you have something like that, expect that inspection to take quite a long time.
No doubt, because you're really looking at not only the main structure, but you're looking everywhere else.
That's right. I'm averaging right now about 3 to 4 hours an inspection on that house to look at everything very carefully. If I have a whole nother house to look at, you're going to have to add at least 2 to 3 hours just to look at that. So pack a lunch, bring a cot, okay? Because it's going to be a long day if I have a lot to look at.
Absolutely, good. What are some typical issues that you run into?
Okay, typical issues. Well, I have my pet peeve issues, like every home inspector. No anti-tip bracket on the range. Okay, the anti-tip bracket is a little device that every kitchen range manufacturer includes, because ranges are very top heavy. So if a child pulls the door down to climb up to get to the cookies, or somebody slips in the kitchen and grabs that oven door to catch themselves, that range can tip. And it doesn't have to even fall all the way over. If you're cooking and it tips a little bit, everything you're cooking falls particularly on you. I was involved many years ago. I was doing a condo. The homeowner was home, which, by the way, I hate. The owner was a personal injury attorney, and he asked me, "Do I look for this?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And I asked him why he asked. He said he was defending a woman who lived in an apartment complex who slipped and fell in the kitchen while she was cooking spaghetti, and all the boiling water fell on her. All right? So it doesn't have to be a child. The little universal symbol on the door that says, "Make sure you install this bracket," shows a child crawling up on the thing. Right. Doesn't have to be a child. Okay. So it gets poo-pooed a lot of times. "Oh, don't worry about that." That's important. And that's the primary reason I do this job, is safety. I don't want anybody getting hurt or killed.
Okay, so that's one pet peeve.
Yes.
Do you have any others?
Pet peeves, gosh, I have a lot of pet peeves. I'm a glasses half empty kind of guy,
I'm sure.
That's why nobody invites me to parties anymore.
That's not true.
Let's see, pet peeve issues. Well, Gosh.
Well, otherwise we can move on to what do you consider to be minor items of repair?
Oh, most of them. Actually, most of the things.
Really?
Most of the things are, you know, are easily fixed or minor in repair. The people, everybody has heard the horror story, the apocryphal story of, oh, I had the home inspection and the house was falling down and the roof was collapsing or there's cracks in the foundation, that sort of thing. That's a very small percentage of the houses that I do. On a day-to-day basis, I've got the leaky faucet, maybe a leak at the toilet. I've got maybe a little leak in the roof around one of the vent stacks because those little rubber seals on the top are very easily cracked. I've got, let's see, peeling paint in places. I probably have a little minor seepage in the foundation wall, especially if it's a concrete block wall. They're very porous. But those are normal things in a house. A house is a system, okay? It's a machine. And so there are parts that need maintenance every once in a while, and it's kind of a constant thing. So all of those things can be fixed, and even the big things can be fixed. It's just a question of how much does it cost and who's going to pay for it.
Absolutely, absolutely. What about, what are red flags for you?
Red flags. Okay, red flags, when you say that, what I conjure in my mind are characteristics or something that I detect that may portend a serious problem in the house. If I walk into the house and I smell musty odor, then I'm worried about mold and water entry into the home. So that'll be probably the first place I go, is straight down to the basement. But it could be subtle things, like I once ran into a house where I went in the basement and there was condensation on the windows in the basement. It didn't seem that it didn't really have a musty smell in the house. And where I could look at the foundation, I wasn't seeing signs of water. Turns out that the furnace was venting back into the house instead of venting the gases out of the house. One of the byproducts of combustion is water vapor, and that moisture that it was spilling into the house was condensing on the cold surface of the glass. So that condensation on that window told me I had a furnace problem.
Was that potentially what's it called, carbon monoxide issue as well?
Absolutely.
As well.
If you have incomplete combustion, that means not all the gas burns away, I will be making carbon monoxide. And so that's another reason that I want to see everybody with carbon monoxide detectors in the house, and a lot of them. I'd like to see one on every level of the home, and I want to see one in that utility area where I have a combustion appliance, gas water heater, gas furnace, oil furnace, gas dryer. One of the things that we can talk about a little bit here in a related note, there's two things actually. One is any kind of combustion appliance requires oxygen to burn. Flame needs oxygen to work right. And if it doesn't get enough, it doesn't burn off all the gas, and necessarily it's now producing carbon monoxide. Most of the time the carbon monoxide is staying confined within the distribution system, the flue system. But, for example, I run into often where the furnace and the water heater is in the same room as the clothes dryer. Well, with the door closed and I turn that dryer on, I'm sucking 250 cubic feet of air per minute out of that house. So I'm sucking air out of there. So it can actually pull the flue gas right out of the furnace, right into the house, okay? So it's important to provide enough combustion air supply to it. So I can't tuck all of these appliances away in a tightly sealed room so it doesn't interfere with where the pool table's going to go or the big 60-inch flat screen TV. I need a louvered door, or I need two vents, one high and one low on the wall, so that it give the appliances enough air and we don't create that vacuum in that room to create a problem. Mm-hmm. The other thing that comes to mind, and you were talking about my pet peeves, this is one of my big ones, are vent-free fireplaces. I hate them. I just don't think they've killed enough people. Yeah, okay? That
I told you he was funny.
So
okay.
that they still allow them. The reason that they are allowed is the manufacturers have installed a device or a configuration of the gas log set in there that's called an ODS, or oxygen depletion sensor. And in most cases, it's a very simple configuration. In the burner, everybody knows you have a pilot light, a small flame that ignites the rest of the burner. That is positioned where it burns next to what's called a thermocouple. It's a little match-like device that sits there, and the flame just burns against the tip of that. When that's heated up, that thermocouple is heated up, it creates a small electrical charge that goes to the furnace regulator, and that's what opens and closes the gas valve. That little charge tells the regulator it's okay to turn on the gas, because the flame's not there. If it opened up, I would just fill the house with gas, right? Well, as the pilot light is positioned in such a way as the oxygen level in the room drops, the flame will rise. Okay, it's just natural physics. And then as the flame comes off of the thermocouple, that cools down, stops the charge, which causes the regulator to shut off the gas. I can't test if it's working. There's no way for me to lower the oxygen level in the room. The second thing is that it is, what was I going to say? That they are not venting the flue gases out of the house. They're going directly into the room. So that means I'm probably going to get carbon monoxide, at least a little bit. Industry standard says I'm allowed to have up to 25 parts per million of carbon monoxide coming off of those things, which is not a tremendous amount, but who wants to be breathing any carbon monoxide? Right. Secondly, let's say it's burning perfectly cleanly and I'm making no CO whatsoever, I'm still making carbon dioxide, nitrogen dioxide like there's nobody's business. And if you have cardiac problems, or if you have pulmonary problems, or respiratory issues, it's going to make your body have to work that much harder to get enough oxygen to operate properly. So even the American Gas Association has come out and said if you have one of these, you are never to run it longer than 4 hours during any given 24-hour period. Wow. Okay? The other thing too is a lot of times they smell. You smell the aldehyde, so the byproducts of combustion. It's not very pleasant. So when I see those, I make sure that my buyer understands that a lot of care needs to be taken when operating these things. I want a CO detector, carbon monoxide detector, right in that room, and you don't operate it for very long, and you certainly want to make sure you don't have children, because that's open, that can get to those, flames, or throw the Barbie doll inside there. So I recommend that they get a screen to fit over those to keep combustibles and people away from those. Okay,
all right. So we talked about basically a musty smell, a damp that can lead to all sorts of issues. Right. And gas and...
yeah, gas leaks, you can smell that.
Anything with, certainly the vent-free fireplaces.
Yes.
Are ones that people can have them, obviously, but you just want to make sure you let the buyers know exactly what they're getting into.
You have to be careful with its operation. It's, as long as you're careful, you're fine with them, all right? Mm-hmm. But you have to make sure that you're careful, and that's the carbon monoxide detector and the screen. Right. As far as other red flags, where people have made their own repairs, okay, I run into that an awful lot. Okay. And I am constantly amazed at the ingenuity and imagination of the average home inspector, our average homeowner, with regard to the way that they fix things. They are the ones that are keeping the duct tape manufacturers in business, okay, because apparently it's used for plumbing, it's used for structural repairs, it's used for just about anything in the house, so I often see those kind of repairs done. I once saw them in an attic where they had a roof leak, a pipe vent that went up through the roof. We talked a little bit about the rubber seals cracking. Yes. Well, it would have been way too easy to call the roofer. Okay, that's not going to do that. Yeah. So they got a length of gutter system, and they cut it to fit against the pipe, and they lashed it to the pipe. And then they ran it with several different sections to a bucket. It was the most impressive Rube Goldberg thing I've ever seen in my life. And it worked, but it really wasn't fixed. We didn't stop the leak. Somebody had to go up in the attic and empty the bucket.
Right.
So that probably cost somebody $75 to have that fixed, but it probably took somebody 2 or 3 hours to put together. So I was impressed. That was impressive.
That's some ingenuity. Yeah.
That's right.
Some ingenuity. Okay. So can you actually detect carbon monoxide?
Sure.
You can.
Yes, absolutely. Most inspectors have a carbon monoxide detector, or should.
Okay.
I carry a lot of tools with me.
Right.
My bag is heavy. I carry gas detectors, combustible gas detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, moisture meters. I've got a thermal imaging camera. I've got, let's see, what else do I have? I've got clamp-on ammeters that I can measure current, and I usually do that with heat pumps, where it has an auxiliary heat section in there. I have to make sure it's working. So I can turn that on, measure how many amps, and that tells me how many of the elements are actually working in there. So the home inspector that you hire needs to have a complement of tools that he's able to bring to bear, he or she needs to be able to bring to bear to tell you as much about the house as possible.
What about dry rot?
Dry rot. Okay, often see that obviously on the exterior. We hope we don't see it on the interior because that's a little more serious. Anymore, the industry has gone to genetically engineered lumber. It used to be that the houses that were built back in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the wood that they were using was heartwood. The grain was really tight. So you'll see these old houses and the paint's all off, but the wood's fine. It just needs paint, right? That's because that grain was so tight that that water couldn't really get in and stay into the wood, so it didn't rot. Today, these genetically engineered trees are genetically engineered to grow very fast, very large, very quickly. So their cellular structure is much larger. The cells are much larger. So it's like building with a kitchen sponge, okay? That water soaks readily in there, stays in there, and it rots in a heartbeat. So it is so important to keep that exterior wood maintained because that's one of the main things. I show up and I look and I know I'm going to see rot. I'm pretty sure I am because my experience that the average homeowner only looks at the exterior of the house from the time they turn into the driveway and into the garage. The rest of the time, the interiors often look beautiful because that's where they exist 24/7, is in that house. Everything's nice. Nobody bothers to look around the outside. And then here comes the jerk with the flashlight who says, this is rotted, this needs repair, and everybody's surprised. It shouldn't be a surprise, you know. In fact, the code councils have actually downgraded the span tables for dimensional lumber. Okay, they made it so to recognize that those 2x10s are not as strong as the 2x10s 30 years ago because of that engineered wood.
Interesting.
So you're now having to do bigger joists or put them closer together to support the same load as 30 years ago.
That's interesting. Okay. What about, let's see, termites?
Termites, all right. Now, most lenders are going to require the buyer to have a termite inspection. They're going to want to see a certificate that says it's free. Yeah. But as a normal part of the home inspection, we're not doing a termite inspection, but we're looking close at everything. So we're usually going to see evidence of termites, and that's certainly going to go in the report. And part of the problem, anytime one of the requirements for home inspectors is if we see any damaged wood, we're required to investigate that to the point where we're actually going to probe that wood, either with an awl or a screwdriver, to determine the amount of rot, where it is, and is that a significant issue with regard to the load-bearing capability of the framing. If I have, for example, if we look at a floor joist here, the bottom is in tension and the top is in compression, meaning it wants to sag. So the bottom is pulling away and the top is pushing together. So if I have rot in the top, it's not as serious because it's pushing it back together, all right? But if it's in the bottom of that, now it's much weaker and can actually fail, all right? So we're using our judgment where it is, how much it is, as to whether or not it needs to be repaired. Obviously, we also have to look at the cause, if it is wood-destroying organism, and you'll see that on the paperwork. It'll say WDO, wood-destroying organisms, and that could be termites, it could be powder post beetles, it could be carpenter bees, carpenter ants, wood borers, anything like that. If that is still actively going on, then we may not have to repair that area, but we certainly have to treat for whatever is causing the damage. If the damage is sufficient enough to where it may threaten the structural integrity of the structure, then that needs to be repaired. But in most cases, it's not a big deal to repair these things. We often, if we have an area, say in the center of a span of a joist that's damaged, we do something called sistering on. So we'll take a like-sized piece of lumber, meaning if I have 2x10 floor joist, I'm going to use a section of 2x10, and I'm going to lengthen it by 3 feet on either side of the damaged area. So 3 feet this way, 3 feet this way. So say a 6-foot piece of lumber, then that gets screwed to the damaged area with the damage in the center. That's usually sufficient enough to take care of the problem, depending upon how big the area is. But in most cases, it's that way. A lot of times we'll have damage at what's called the band board and the sill plate. That's where your foundation wall is. So your foundation wall sits like this. You have a 2x4, 2x6 that lays flat across the top of that, and that's called the sill. And then you have a floor joist that sits on top of that, and that's what's holding up the floor. If I have any rot back in that area, well, that's a load-bearing member. It's carrying the weight of the wall. So I'll start to see compression if that starts to fail, meaning that wood is squishing down. In that case, then I am going to have to do something a little more extensive. I'm going to have to put solid blocking in there, may have to cut out that section of sill plate and put another one in. But that's done all the time, and I don't want my customers to feel that this is the end of the world.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, the house is falling down.
Yes.
It's got a little damage, but it's easily fixed, okay? Right. Again, it goes back to how much does it cost and who's going to pay for it.
Right.
And
so
that's
some issues that seem to be big issues aren't necessarily as
end of the
they don't
world.
have to be as scary. It can still be a good house even though it needs some repair.
And that's part of the home inspector's job, is to put things into perspective.
Absolutely.
Okay, I've run into a handful of times over 30 years where I've, in not so many words, said, here are the matches. Okay, it'd be cheaper to just tear the house down and rebuild it than it would be to fix all of these things. But most of the time, I've got issues that need to be fixed. They're important to be fixed. We just have to figure out what it's going to cost, and then figure out how, negotiate the price.
Absolutely.
Certain problems, let's get into, say, marine clay, okay, and that is a problem soil in this area. It has a high shrink-swell ratio, meaning the way marine clay is it's made up of tiny particulates of dirt or earth or stone. And it is so small, if you were to think of it like, if I take a marble and I dip a marble into a glass of water and I shake it off, it's still wet. There's still water adhering to the surface, okay? So now that marble has grown a little bit in circumference because of the water that's on there. With these tiny little pieces, that water does that on all those pieces, so that earth swells with the moisture. And then conversely, when it dries out, it really shrinks down. So the soil can really move quite a bit. Well, it can drop out from under a footing during a dry period, and the house can go boom, like that, and drop. Or it can put a lot of pressure laterally on a foundation wall, especially a block wall, which doesn't have a lot of lateral strength. Think of it like children's building blocks. If I build a wall, I can stand on it, but as soon as I push it, it falls over. That's what I've got with a block concrete wall. And if I start pushing on that with the soil, now I've got some serious problems because that is holding the rest of the house up. That can be fixed, but then we start getting into some pricey repairs with that, with internal pilasters or reinforcements of the wall, possibly excavating out the problem soil, putting new...
So that could be a red flag.
That's absolutely. So when we're looking at the foundation wall, we're looking for cracks. There's a cut, if I'm seeing a horizontal crack in a block wall, usually right in the center of the wall. That's the weakest point. We call that a bending wall crack. So typically my wall is straight. If it starts doing this, I'm going to get that crack right here along the outside. That's that soil pushing in on that. I often see that, and usually they're very small, and if it's an older house with a very small crack, I'm going to say, we're going to work on the grading and the drainage outside to reduce the potential for horizontal movement and keep an eye on it. If I can stick my finger in the crack, then I'm going to start saying, let's get the structural engineer out. And their sole job is to say, with this amount of movement, can the wall still hold the load? And that's really all they're asked to do. They can't predict the future, neither can I. You know, I can see what I've got there. So.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
So let me ask you then, as far as buyers encountering, for example, the following things like lead-based paint. Now we know that 1978 was really the time that lead-based paint
was
stopped being used.
Right.
But can you detect whether you can see presumably if it's flaky, you can see if it's more of an issue than if it's really covered up. So that could be that could definitely be a message to a buyer who may have young children. So you can tell. You'll know from the age of the property whether there is any lead-based paint, but you can also look at the condition.
Well, I can say likelihood. Congress moves like molasses, okay? Because there are a lot of lobbyists that go in, that, you know, especially from the paint industry, that said, no, 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 it's okay. By 1960, most of the paint manufacturers had gone to titanium from lead as their base. It was still being produced, lead-based paint was still being produced, but less and less and less. So, let's say I have a house built in '77, so it's right before the law. Chances are it probably doesn't have lead-based paint, okay, by that period of time. But the concern would be ingestion, okay? And there are a couple of different ways. Obviously, remember the TV commercials where the child is in the crib eating the paint chips off of the peeling windowsill. But it can also be ingested by dust that's created from windows and doors being opened and closed. It causes that deterioration of the paint and creates a dust of it that can be inhaled, all right? So our concern with lead-based paint is really around trim, windows, and doors. The walls, as long as they are kept painted, are not a hazard, okay? That paint is considered encapsulated. So if I have a house that I'm pretty sure by its age is going to have lead-based paint, I'm going to say, well, if you can keep it well painted, then I'm not exposed to it. You might consider replacing the trim altogether, or there are certain companies out there that can dip the trim. If I've got an old house and I want to keep the architectural features intact, I can take that wood to them and they will dip it. They'll basically put it in a vat of paint remover and completely chemically remove all of the lead-based paint, and then I just put it back into place and paint it. Replacement of doors and windows also takes care of that chalking of the paint.
Okay. What about asbestos tiles?
Asbestos, well, asbestos tiles, asbestos comes in a number of forms. And that's that same era where it was outlawed for residential use. But again, the lawsuit with Johns Manville was about 1972, 73. So by then, the whole industry took notice of how Johns Manville lost that lawsuit big time, and they stopped really making it for things in residential use. But you can find asbestos. There are vinyl asbestos floor tiles. The house I grew up in, whole first floor was that material. So you'll have asbestos as fibers for the binder of the tile and also the mastic or the adhesive that was used. With regard to floor tiles, the rule is let's leave them alone. Okay, if we can not damage them, which would free the fibers, because they're not just floating around, they are embedded in that stuff. If I leave it alone, it's not a hazard. It's when I start scraping it up or there's water coming in and loosening them and they're breaking up, then the fibers can become friable or be able to be breathed in, and that's the hazard. So if I have a house that has that, and I have one the other day, I said, if we can leave these in place and just cover them over with carpeting or something else like that, we're perfectly fine. If you have to remove them, then I need an asbestos abatement company. They're going to come in, tape off everything,
right.
moon suits and all of that.
Right.
You can also find asbestos in transite board, which is a cementitious board that's around furnaces back in the 30s, 40s, 50s. I can have fiberglass or asbestos insulation. It's very rare, but I've run into it in an apartment complex in Annandale. How you deal with that, that's a real problem because it was an apartment, you know, so you have to deal with the owner of the apartment of all this stuff. So it comes in different forms. We know enough to recognize what substances probably have it, but legally I can't say this is asbestos. I have to say suspected asbestos containing material, and that's what most inspectors are going to say.
Okay. What about polybutylene pipes?
Polybutylene was a material that started showing up back in the late 70s. It was initially used in places like Alaska, where we had problems with pipes freezing all the time, and these would actually expand and contract and be less problematic. Plus, they were easily installed. So the builder said, hey, this is cheap. Let's start using this stuff. It's inexpensive and it's an approved material. But it took some skill to hook that together. The other problem is, in Alaska, we didn't have a lot of chlorinated water. Here we did, and so the chlorine was not kind to the polybutylene. It reacted with it and could make it brittle and cause it to break, all right? So that, up until 1994, people were using that both as distribution pipes inside the house and as well as the service line from the street to the house. 94 was the start of the lawsuits. It was Hess, Celanese, Shell, and DuPont were the big manufacturers of this. And they did settle and create a pot of money for people to make claims against. I believe all of that money is now gone, but the vast majority of the polybutylene has been replaced. But a buyer can still run into a house with the stuff and need to be made aware of it. If I find it throughout the house, I'm going to tell them budget to replace it and replace it as soon as they possibly can.
And is it the chlorine in the water that's eating away?
It's that, and it's the fittings themselves and the way that they were installed. There was a special crimp tool that was needed to make those connections, and that crimp tool had to be perfectly calibrated just to give just the right amount of pressure. Too hard, it'll crack. Too loose, it'll fail. And so that wasn't always done.
Do you think because I know that there are chlorine filters that people can actually put on a house.
That, right.
Do you think that that might help mitigate a problem like that? Or would you still say budget to replace? And would you replace them straight away? Or would you replace, you know, a bit here and a bit there? Because that's an expense.
It's a huge expense.
Yeah.
And I would just say, do you like going to Las Vegas a lot? You know,
Like you're taking a gamble?
There, you're taking a gamble. When is it going to fail? Because we can lay eyes on what we can see. We can't lay eyes on what's inside the walls and inside the ceilings. Do I have something that, if I could see it, I would go, that looks, you know, kind of sketchy, and that could fail. Yeah. So.
Okay. So basically beware with the polybutylene pipes.
Yes.
What about Chinese drywall?
We don't see a lot of it in this area. It made its way mostly up to Newport News and that area during that time period. But one of the signs that you're going to see of this stuff, it outgasses sulfur. There was a lot of sulfur in the gypsum that was used as the filler between the two pieces of paper, plywood, or cardboard. You'll see darkening or tarnishing of copper pipes and of copper wires. That's one of the things that you'll notice. So I've gone into houses where you can see the copper pipes are black, okay, and that would be an indication of that. The only repair is to replace it. There's no fix for it in place. But like I said, I've only run into it like once.
Okay, so it's not as prevalent around
no.
here. Okay, what about a rusty in-ground oil tank?
Okay. If you've ever looked on one of those tanks, and this is kind of amazing to me, is that they are steel tanks, and on the top there is an embossed label that says for interior use only. All right, but they bury those suckers, so they're going to rust, and it's just a matter of when they're going to do it. They could do it in as little as 15 years. The majority of the ones, I often deal with a company called Pollard Environmental, that their sole job is to inspect those tanks. And the majority of the ones that they go out and see are leaking to some extent or another. It may just be a little bit. But every time I see one of those things, that's a must-do that I convey to the buyers. This has to be investigated, okay? Because it could be a real mess, especially out in the country where I have wells. If that oil gets into the aquifer and starts contaminating people's wells, that's a disaster. So.
Okay. All right. Cracks in exterior walls or in roof trusses.
Okay. Any load-bearing item that has any signs of movement in it needs further evaluation, either by me or a structural engineer, depending upon the magnitude of the crack. Like I said, we all sag as we get older, okay? And so we're going to see some movement in the wood. We're going to see probably a little movement, especially if it's a block foundation, going back to the weaknesses there. But if I have a 50-year-old house and I have a 1/16 of an inch crack, I'm probably not going to think too much of it, all right? Once I look at the outside, make sure that there's nothing else that looks like it could be causing it or it's new. But if I have a large enough crack, then that needs to be evaluated. As far as trusses, engineered trusses are engineered so that every component within that truss is perfectly in tension or compression, okay? And if I just cut or crack one, that changes the load path of all of those things. It can weaken it. When I have like one truss that has a problem, I don't have to, I'm not overly concerned. It needs to be repaired, but I'm not overly concerned. I've run into houses where somebody said, I want to make this a living space, or I want more storage, got the Sawzall and just started cutting out all the interior members of the trusses. I don't know, I've run into that 15, 20 times. And I get in there and you're going to have to retruss that roof. Okay, there's no other way to really fix it at that point, which means you're going to lose your ceiling. All right, because that all has to come off, new ceiling, new insulation, new trusses, so that's a big deal.
Mm-hmm. Okay, aluminum wiring?
Right, either one. That was a material, we're talking about the small gauge, not the big gauge stranded. That's still perfectly fine. It's the small gauge, meaning number 12s and number, let's see, you would be 12s and 10s because they're a size larger than copper. Aluminum has two issues with it. One, it has more resistance to electron flow, electrical flow. So it heats up a little bit and it'll expand and contract as the power is on and off to it. That wire is under a terminal screw and that constant movement can eventually loosen its connection. Once I get a space there, I start to cause sparking or arcing, and then the heat really begins and I have an issue. The other issue is aluminum will oxidize. Like steel rusts, aluminum oxidizes. And electricity doesn't flow through a wire, it flows on the surface of the wire. Okay, it's called the skin effect. And if I have corrosion on that wire, that creates resistance, which then creates heat, which then can create a fire. So that's the issue with aluminum wiring. There's a couple of different ways to fix it. One is to rewire the house, which nobody wants to do because it's very expensive to do. You can also do something called copper pigtailing, where they will take the end of the aluminum wiring and connect a piece of copper wire to it and make the connection with copper. Remember, our problem is at the connections, not at the entire length of the wire. So that's usually fine. Then there's a version of that that the CPSC recommends called, I'm trying to think of the name of the company. The type of connection is called a copper-aluminum crimp or copper aluminum secure. It's actually a specific crimp. It takes a special tool that mechanically fastens that little pigtail to the existing wire. That's the only method that the Consumer Product Safety Commission recommends. However, there's very few people out there that do that work because you have to rent the equipment from the Ideal company who makes it, and it's expensive and there's very little work to do. There's not that many that do it, so there's no money in it. The Ideal company also came out with a special wire connector. People call them wire nuts. It's purple in color that was made specifically for that information, or for that particular connection. But the CPSC doesn't recognize it, okay, because they used modern aluminum wiring in their testing. So, but as far as I'm concerned, those are probably just fine, rather than even a normal wire connector. So if we change the connectors at the switches, the wall outlets, and ceiling lights or fans, that's where the issue is. And that's a lot less expensive, and that's pretty safe. I would also say at that point, recommend something called an arc fault circuit interrupter, breakers on all of those circuits. That's a rather new creature that monitors the electrical sine wave on those wires. So if there's a disturbance, that means I've got sparks or arcing somewhere, even inside the walls, it'll shut off the power, all right? And then we can get the electrician out to figure out what's going on. So those two things, and that's fine, and that's not nearly, we don't have to rewire the house.
That's good to know. All right, what's CSST?
Okay. CSST is a relatively new material. It stands for corrugated stainless steel tubing. It's used to convey gas rather than the hard black iron pipe or even the drawn copper tubing. This is an easier material to work with, but the walls of that tubing are very thin. All right, so there are certain things that you have to pay attention to as far as installation, or that I look for. Like a bend can't have a radius greater than 3 inches. I can't bend it at like a right angle because I will crimp that, and now that can fail. And failure of that material can be catastrophic. So it's important to look at that, look at the connections, how it's made, and more importantly, that it's electrically bonded to the house electrical system. And bonding is a little different than ground. If I ground something, I'm taking a wire from that material directly to earth ground, to a rod. Bonding means I'm taking a wire from that material to the electric panel, which then goes to earth ground, all right? Now, the Commonwealth of Virginia, in our standards of practice, only addresses one item that says I have to specifically say this about this thing, and it's CSST, because of the potential for failure. So it says that I have to recommend that an electrician come out. If I don't see a ground and the house was built before 2008, you need to get an electrician out there to make sure it's bonded.
Okay, very good. What about radon? Would you say that radon is always, it's always a good idea for a buyer to test for radon?
With my experience, it certainly doesn't hurt, but there's certain areas of the county where I'm going to say chances are there's not much of a chance that you're going to have it here. Radon, the decay chain that produces radon starts with uranium. And in this area, we pretty much find uranium in granite. We can also have it in some forms of other rock in other areas of the county. But if I'm in Alexandria near the Potomac, well, I'm in that coastal plain area is what the geologists would call it, which is sands and silts. So the odds of me having radon there are pretty slim. But if I'm in areas like Great Falls, McLean, Oakton, Herndon, some areas of Centerville, there's a road there called Little Rocky Run. Well, there's a lot of radon there. So as radon, to kind of catch you up with the way radon comes into being, it starts with uranium. And then as uranium decays, it becomes polonium, and then becomes a version of bismuth, becomes another version of polonium, and then it becomes radium. Now, radium used to be the material that they would paint clock faces with because it glowed in the dark. So as radium decays, it emits radon gas. And we're not even concerned about the gas itself. It's its progeny. As it decays, it's emitting gamma radiation, X-rays, or gamma radiation, X-rays, beta particles, and alpha particles. And we don't care about really any of them except the alpha particles, because the rest pass easily through us. The alpha particles are pretty big, and they will plate out on bits of dust and dirt in the air, and we breathe those in. Now, as the alpha particle decays, it explodes like a little tiny firecracker. So it will, it keeps doing that in your lungs. Now, over a period of time, this constant bombardment of that little explosion can either do nothing to you. It may kill a cell or two, or it could cause the cell to mutate, and then that's lung cancer. So that's the mechanism. Children are a lot more susceptible to this because their respiration rates are much higher, and they're down on the carpet, you know, running around, kicking up the dirt and dust that stuff is playing. So it's always a good idea, and it's inexpensive to test. So why not just go ahead and see what you've got and make sure that it's not so high that you need to remediate.
And remediation is really quite straightforward.
Very straightforward, and typically if I don't have to deal with finished surfaces or do anything special, it only costs about $700 or $800. So it's not an end of the world thing. If the house comes back with high radon, don't panic. It's, you know, that sub-slab suction method of remediation is very, very effective. And there's it's tested after its installation by a third party who's not part of the installer to verify that what the installer has done is working.
What can a homeowner do ahead of time to reduce the number of repairs that a home inspector may pick up on?
Okay, well, first and foremost, they can call out a home inspector to come out and go through the house and look at the things that the home inspector that the buyers are going to hire is going to be looking at too. But, and I recommend this to every homeowner, every one of my customers, I'm going to say, you see what I'm doing. I'm walking around the house, I'm laying eyes on all these details everywhere. Do that at least once, if not twice a year. Say once in the spring, once in the fall. I want you to do what I'm doing. Go out here, look, stand back, look at the front of the house, put your eye on all the trim, look at the windows, and catch those little things before they become big ones, because you know the home inspector is going to catch them. Look under the sinks. I can't tell you how many times I've gone into the kitchen and I've had to spend like 10 minutes pulling all the soap and the sponges and everything out, and the bottom of the cabinet's gone because they didn't notice that disposer's been just leaking and that little plywood bottom has completely rotted out. So pull those things out. Look under the sinks. Go in the utility room. Look behind the washer and the dryer. Just run the faucets. Is water coming out where it shouldn't be? You could buy a little electrical plug tester. They're inexpensive, less than 10 bucks. Go around and just plug it into the outlets. Make sure the little lights are telling you that it's working okay. But never, ever take the panel cover off the electric panel. Okay, leave that to somebody who knows what they're doing, because there's some pieces in there that will bite, and they will bite hard. Mm-hmm. So other than that, just go around and look at everything, look under everything, and usually with the eye of the realtor. The realtor is going to come in here too and say, I suggest you do this, or you might have somebody look at that because you've got that trained eye to know the things that come up all the time.
Absolutely. What about a buyer who is interested in purchasing a brand new home? Would you suggest a home inspection is required then?
Absolutely. I'd say about 15–20% of my business is doing new home construction, and the real reason is people build houses. People make mistakes. Now, during the process of construction, most people say, well, it's a new house, what could be wrong? Well, you've got a site superintendent who is in charge of keeping all the subs in check, making sure that all their subcontractors are doing what they are supposed to be doing at the time they're supposed to be doing it. But you have to multiply that by 6, 8, 10 houses that one site superintendent is having to pay attention to. So the amount of time and care that he's going to be able to take with your house is limited, all right? Secondly, we have the county inspector. So everybody says, well, the county's going to look at it. I remember back in the mid-2000s, I talked to the head of Fairfax County Inspection Department. He told me at that time, it's different today, but at that time they had 37 inspectors and they did 1,100 inspections a day. Okay, so you can do the math and know how long each inspector was looking at the house. They have a few things they're told to look at, they have their pet peeve items, and then they're gone. They're going to spend 15 minutes, 20 minutes in that house, and then they're off to their next required job. I'm spending 3 to 4 hours. So I'm looking at all these little details that the other people just don't have the time to be able to look at.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so with new home inspection, you may actually do more than one. because you may do a pre-drywall.
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
So that you can really look at the wiring before the drywall goes up.
That's
Make
right.
sure all the systems are in place as they should be.
Yes.
And then you come back once the drywall is up and the systems have been installed to take another look.
Right.
And they'll possibly even come back
At the 11th month.
11 months later.
And I get that question too. Should I go ahead and do one at settlement or should I wait? And I said, it's up to you, but I could make a strong case for waiting until the 11th month before you do another one, because you have the advantage of being in the house for all the different seasons, know which rooms are hotter or colder. If you've had a past leak, I can look at some other things and you have experience with the home. So I think that's not a bad idea, is to wait till the 11th month and then I can create that list to be able to go back to the builder.
To the builder,
right.
For their punch-out list. Right. So we've really sort of touched on the qualifications of a home inspector, I think, beforehand. And what would you say buyers should look for in a good home inspector? Because they may not be able to tell one from the other.
First and foremost, experience, because there's no substitute for that. You can have graduated from this school or that school, but I tell you what, I've done more than 12,000 inspections, and I've learned from every one of them, and there's, experience means a lot. Secondly, you want to avoid, I'll put it that way, any inspector that doesn't want you at the inspection, okay? There's some out there that say, don't bother me, I'm gonna go do it, and then I'll send you the report. If you have any questions, ask me. Half of my job is education, so I hate it when my buyers are not there. I want to show them hands-on, this is where the main water shutoff valve is. This is where the electrical cutoff is. This is how you're going to caulk this area. That's half of what I do. The other half, of course, is documenting the condition of the house. You want to make sure, you see how long they plan on taking. If they say, yeah, they're going to take 45 minutes, well, you know that they can't be doing that thorough job. So you want to make sure that they're taking their time. Many have errors and omissions insurance, but that's not a requirement in the Commonwealth. The requirement for insurance is strictly for general liability, and I believe it's $250,000, and that's there in case they drop the ladder on, the neighbor's car, or they break the lamp, or something like that. But errors and omissions insurance, now while it is designed to protect the inspector, you know that inspector has gone the extra mile to be professional and cover all of his bases. Anything else that they should do? Make sure that the report ask for a sample of the report. If there's still a few people that are using NCR paper, and that is, it's hard to read, it's usually nothing but check boxes. I want to see something that has a good amount of narrative in there, because you can be very specific about those issues.
Photographs, of course.
And of course photographs, because if I take the picture right, I don't have to write anything really. Right. It's self-evident. If I've got a leak at the faucet, I can catch that, you can't argue.
And of course that's a report that's going to be read by the seller and the listing agent. And
yes.
So if there are any repairs they want to address, they really need to know what they're up against.
Exactly.
What they're doing. As far as county code is concerned, I'm assuming that part of what you do is you're looking to see if things are to code, and you would label them if they're not, you flag them if they're not.
Well, okay. Code is, if we're talking about new construction, the builders got involved in the licensing of home inspectors, and that was one of the issues that they insinuated into our law, is legally, I can't quote code on a new house. I'm not allowed, all right, which is silly. So what if I run into an area where the stairs are uneven and somebody could fall? I can't quote code and say, this is too far out. I have to just say, industry standards would dictate that this is out. As far as older houses, we're not going to hold an older house up to today's code. It's not fair, all right? I may make some suggestions, because codes are for safety, like ground fault circuit interrupter outlets in the kitchen. In 1979, well, they didn't require them. I'm going to say this would be a good improvement. It's not a code violation because the house was built in 79, but this would be a good improvement. At the same token too, if, for example, somebody has removed the electrical smoke detectors in a house and put battery ones up there instead, and well, the code was, I need electrical smoke detectors on every level of the house in each bedroom. If they're not electrical, then that's a code violation. I'm not going to say it is, but I'm going to say to the standards that it was built, this is incorrect and this should be returned to the way it should have been and was required to be.
What do you do personally to safeguard your clients that other inspectors may not do? And I think we've touched upon some of this in terms of the time that you spend, your insurance, your training, etc. Is there anything else that you'd like to highlight that you'd like to do to make sure your people are well taken care of?
Not only is it important for me to document everything I can find and be as thorough as I possibly can be, do the best job every time I go out there, I have to convey this information to my buyer in a manner in which they can accept it. And that means I've got different types of people that I deal with. I've got the nonchalant person that doesn't care about anything because they're just going to redo the kitchen or they're going to redo this. They figure whatever I say is just, I have to do this. And I need to make sure that I impress upon them the importance of some of these things. Conversely, I also have the person who is scared to death. All right, they are just worried about every little thing, and I need to be able to say, calm down, everything's fixable, let's go through these things and decide the order of magnitude of the problem and what needs to be fixed first. And I always tell them that, you know, rule number one is don't panic. There's going to be problems in every house. They're usually just minor problems and need to be addressed. But if you say, I'm scared because there's so many problems in this house, I'm going to go find another house, I guarantee you I'm probably going to find the same problems in the next house.
Right.
So I need to impress upon them and get them to understand that this is normal and we deal with them and we, you know, that's just the way it works.
Right. So part of the work that you do with buyers is essentially educate them to what's going on in the house, but also give them some perspective.
That's
so that,
really
you know,
important.
there may be a very long list and they may be absolutely terrified, as you pointed out, and want to reject the house, but the chances are that another house will have some very similar issues. So the question is to see what the gravity of the issues is, and then make a determination based on that. And as we know, everything is negotiable.
That's very important. I write a lot of stuff up because even the little things start to add up, but they're little things, all right? But if you look at my report, sometimes they read like War and Peace, and that is off-putting to every, you know, my buyer. It's a lot of information, and so it's important for me to put those into perspective and say, this is, you know, you can wait on fixing this, even though you're going to see this in the report, fix it. But you don't have to break your neck to do it.
And that actually makes our job as buyer agents and listing agents easier as well, because it gives the client a sense of what's most urgent and what isn't, and to keep things sort of balanced, because people do panic.
Oh yes.
And
because they don't know.
They're not understand.
That's right. I've had people freak out about broken hermetic seals in windows, where I've had several of those, and it's like, this house is falling apart, and I have to explain, you can replace the pane for like $100.
If the house has so much else going for it, items don't necessarily have to, they don't have to exclude the house because of it.
Right.
You throw the baby out with the bathwater. So,
exactly.
But it's good. It's great that you take that approach. It's so much information. Jen.
There's a lot. You ought to be the buyer, and they're going.
A lot of information.
Right.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, Jim Funkhouser from Inspective Home Inspector here in the Northern Virginia area. It's been an absolute pleasure, Jim.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Take care.